Alright, so this is the second video dealing with Japanese expansion, the years 1931 through 1941, and we're still looking at causes of Japanese expansion, and in particular how significant was the impact of nationalism and militarism on Japan's foreign policy. And so the first video we left off with early Japanese expansion, and in particular the results of the Russo-Japanese War. We talked about how the Japanese victory in this war made them a major political and military power in the Far East. We also said that it was likely to bring Japan into conflict with Great Britain and the United States. Both Great Britain and the United States had interests and possessions in the Pacific. So in 1905, Great Britain and the United States recognized Japanese interest in Korea in return for Japan's promise not to mess with the Philippines. This is going to allow Japan to consolidate its control of Korea. In 1905, Korea was named a Japanese protectorate, and in 1910, Japan annexed Korea and made it part of their empire. So the next aspect of nationalism, militarism that we want to look at would be the First World War and Japanese nationalism. And so with World War One, the main war aim of Japan was to take over the German concessions in China. And to help them do this, they in January of 1915 they presented what was called the 21 Demands to China, and this was this included demands that Germany's concessions be transferred to Japan, and for Chinese recognition of special Japanese interest in various areas, once again including South Manchuria. This also demanded that the Japanese had influence over particular aspects of China's political, financial, and military affairs. And they also wanted China to accept Japanese advisors in its government. These 21 demands were opposed by the United States, and eventually Japan was forced to withdraw some of the harsher terms, and then China would sign the agreement. Japan, even if since they were on, even though they were on the side out of the Allies during World War One, they were disappointed with some of the gains from the Paris peace treaties in 1919 and 1920. They didn't get outright ownership of the former German Pacific colonies. They did control, some of they did get some concessions, but they didn't get Germany's colonies in Asia. And the nationalists in Japan felt like they had been unfairly treated. And this is one of the reasons why Japan, Italy, and Germany joined and became the Axis powers by 1940. The feeling that the Paris peace settlements were unfair to them for various reasons. Another aspect of concern or discontent in Japan, especially by the nationalist groups, was that in 1919 at the Paris Peace Conference, Japan had proposed a racial equality clause. This would be part of the Covenant of the League of Nations, and it was blocked. And so a lot of the nationalists, once again, this has added fuel to their argument about nationalism and about the unfair treatment from the West. And after World War One, we saw militarism, nationalism, and expansion ideas continue to increase in the 1920s, and we'll see this a little bit more after, when we look at the domestic issues. But dealing with sticking with the militarism and nationalism, theme, we did see some naval conference agreements that would help Japan's stature in the Pacific. The first one would be the Washington Conference. We talked about this just the other day. The Washington Disarmament Conference was in 1921 1922. Excuse the typos here. And a lot of these main powers agreed to naval arms limitations. When we talked about the 5-5-3 ratio, for every five battleships the British have, the United States has 5, and Japan has 3. However, the big thing here is that the British and the United States agreed not to build any new bases in the Pacific, and they agreed not to not to have any bases or new bases, within 3,000 miles of Japanese borders. The next one would be the 1930 London Disarmament Conference, and once again, this deals with these ratios, right? And we see that there becomes a split here in after these disarmament conferences between the civilian government who agrees to these agreements, agrees to these limitations and ratios that were put into place by these conferences and these treaties, and the militarists and nationalists who wanted to challenge the civilian government, who wanted to increase the power of the Japanese army, because they felt like this was a way that Japan could expand, and this was a way that Japan could create an empire for self-sufficiency, create an empire for international prestige, and create an empire to end its dependence on the West. So these naval conference agreements, while we said that they were good for the international world order, they might have decreased tension. In Japan, they actually increased tension between the civilian government and those militarists and nationalists that were rising in power and prestige and followings in the 1920s. All right, so the second area here is political and economic issues, and the question that we want to be able to answer would be the question: what impact did Japan's main domestic issues have on foreign policy? So looking at the Japanese economy from the years 1868 to 1929, beginning with the Meiji Restoration, we saw that Japan experienced massive and extensive industrialization. They saw a rapid population increase. They had that slogan, enrich the country, strengthen the military, and this idea that the strong economy and military would ensure Japan would never be bullied or dominated by the Western powers. And we saw this approach pay off with the First Sino-Japanese War. We saw it pay off with the Russo-Japanese War in 1905. However, this did cause two problems for Japan. Japan had two domestic problems. One, the lack of raw materials, and two, the insufficient land for the rapidly growing population. And the solution for some of these the Japanese leaders would be to side with those militarists and nationalists. Once again, expansion would provide enough land for the growing population, and also expansion would provide those raw materials for Japan as well. The 1920s, we saw a series of economic panics, and as a result of this, we saw small industries absorbed by these larger ones, and smaller bank and financial centers absorbed by larger ones called zaibatsus. These are just Japanese conglomerates in the financial sectors and the industrial sectors. We also saw in the 1920s more military spending. We saw Japan really start to exploit their colonies, or we saw the economic exploitation of Japan's colonies. However, the real turning point with Japan, and as far as economic and political issues go, would be the Great Depression in 1929, and really looking at the economic impact of the Great Depression in Japan. Something to think about here is Japan was not self-sufficient in coal, iron, oil, tin, or rubber, and this is really going to cause it to suffer badly during the Great Depression, as it was an industrial economy. The Japanese economy also depended on exports, and as the depression worsened, Japan's major export, silk, was hit badly as the sale of silk fell dramatically, dropped by 80%. Japan's total exports dropped by 50% by 1931. By 1931, 50% of all Japan's factories closed down, and to make matters worse, we started to see a lot of countries respond to the economic depression, or the Great Depression, by putting tariffs on imported goods to protect their own domestic industries. And so Japan was hurt by this, and they weren't able to sell their products such as silk in the other countries, and so this is really going to cause militarists to pick up the intensity of their hostility and really start to call for an expansionist foreign policy to replace the existing policy of international cooperation, and they point to the current state of the Japanese economy. They point to the tariffs that are being placed on them, and they say this is why we need a new international order. This is why we need an aggressive nationalism, and this is why expansion was the only way Japan could solve its problems in light of the impact of the actions of the Great Depression. And so, as a result of the actions and the impact of the Great Depression, we really saw the political system in Japan being challenged, and Japan Japan politically, after 1918, was a parliamentary democracy, in theory, really. But throughout the 1920s, it was continued to be challenged by the zaibatsus, those large financial and industrial conglomerates. It was continued to be challenged by militarist groups, by right-wing ultra-nationalist groups, by these young military officers that were starting to organize these political circles. Throughout the 1920s, you saw a lot of nationalist groups starting to sprout up here, run by these ultra-nationalists or these young military officers who really wanted to see Japan expand, and who opposed the disarmament policies like in Washington or in London, who didn't want to cooperate with these Western countries. And by the end of the 1920s, we saw the end of an attempt to develop a democratic system in Japan, and the start instead of the road towards increased militarism and eventual war. And this is because, like we said before, like as the economic situation worsened, the influence and the activities of these anti-democratic groups went up. And in the 1930s and 1931, you saw time after time again these nationalist groups like the Blood Brotherhood League or the Suyukai Party. They're organizing these attempted assassinations. They have these hit lists on government officials, including officials all the way up to the Prime Minister. And they would attempt to assassinate these leaders who were seen as being cooperating with the West, not putting Japan's interest first, not being expansionist enough, not supporting the military. And so we really see that transition towards in Japan, away from democracy and more towards that military style of government here, as a result of the economic depression and the growth of these ultra-nationalist groups. The third area that we want to look at as far as causes for Japanese expansion would be the political instability in China. And in the next video, we're going to look at a couple phases of the weak Chinese political world. We want to start off with the Manchu dynasty in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and the unequal treaties that they were signing, which made China, be labeled as a sick man of Asia. We want to look at China domestically and some of the turmoil that they were experiencing, beginning with the Revolution of 1900 and the attempts to establish a parliamentary democracy through the warlord period, and then finally the Civil War that begins and breaks out in 1928 between the GMD led by Yang Yeshi and the CCP led by Mao Zedong, which will ultimately last from 1928 to 1949, with a short time period in between there from 37 to 46 with the Second Sino-Japanese War. And that will be handled in our third video installment for this series.